Okay. For some reason, it always looks crooked. It's okay. So basically, look, if you don't show up for your presentation and you post it on the Moodle site, you only get half marks, max, right? The idea is that you have to both, post it and present it. And if you present it, but you don't post it, again, half marks. So I just want to check with people that are here, who probably are all in the know. Does everybody understand how it's working? Yes or no? Because we should get it cleared up. So you're going to be doing, one seminar presentation, I believe, is it one or two? I think it's cyber politics is two. I think this one is, it's one, yeah, because there's way more people. In cyber politics, it's a seminar course. There's only 23 people. So you're going to be doing one seminar presentation that you picked out of the plastic bag, right? You're going to be posting it on the Moodle site the night before, and you're going to be coming to class to present. In terms of discussion form, and someone asked a very good question, I expect 1 or 2 up to about 12 posts that are substantive posts for the duration of the course. And you can either start your new thread, as you asked, or you can add to a thread. When I grade them, I look under your name. So, and what else? Any other questions? The lectures, of course, are online, usually by the afternoon, if not sooner, because they're being taped on an iPhone and then they're just being airdropped and then downloaded into my video account. So that's all there. If you don't know when you're presenting, see me at break time. And also, I'll show you where to find out on the Moodle site. Please use the Moodle site. Does everybody here use Moodle in other courses or not? Yeah. Okay, so you guys are all good with that. Awesome. Then what you'll see on the Moodle site is you'll see both the discussion. So what I put discussion points up for the lectures I'm doing, plus a concept film. I'm going to show the discussion points in class right now. Then I'm going to go on and have the film loop in the background. So what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to start off again linking it with politics, but what we're going to talk about in the 5 lectures, we're going to finish that and we're going to move on to civilization and its discontents. And maybe let me set the politics out again, just so you can keep it firmly in mind. Then I'll go through what we're going to talk about, then I'll start the lecture. Now, it shows online that there are 4 people presenting today. Yes?
Sorry, so you post these on Moodle? Or?
Yes.
Oh.
I'll show you exactly where they are on Moodle. They're right under lecture films and lecture concept points. Every week I post, 5 lectures, lectures 4 and 5, civilization and discontents 1 and 2. Those are the concept points. And I also post a lecture, film. Okay? So they're always there. And I advise, take a look at them while you're doing the reading. Okay, just so you know what I'm going to concentrate on. In terms of politics, I did this lecture last week, and I want to just pick up on a couple of things in terms of Freud. So first of all, I'd like to back up just a little bit and say how politics is being defined. We're going to use a broad definition, and I suggested Leftwich's definition of what is politics, the activity and its study, but the broad definition is about how people should live. There's an ought here. So in terms of politics, quote, politics is the heart of all collective social activity, formal and informal, public and private, in all human groups, institutions, and societies. It takes place at every level of social interaction, that is at the family level, groups of friends, relationships, nations, transnational, and globally. In terms of Freud, what we talked about last week and what we're finishing up this week, coming out of his 5 lectures, are key concepts that underlie a psychological understanding of politics. So we talked about hysteria, we talked about neurosis, fixation of life, of mental health to traumas of the past, repression both at individual and social levels. Today we're going to talk about the Oedipal Complex, object choice, instinct drive, fetishism, perversion, sublimation, transference, which is going to finish up on key concepts and then get us to civilization and its discontents. What becomes really interesting playing out in politics is what one would call necropolitics or thanopolitics, where you'll see the life instinct of Eros and the death instinct playing out in a broad understanding of politics and in the narrow understanding of politics as politics among states. Once we start doing civilization and its discontents, which we're going to start this class, what you then have is the development process of the individual and society. We started with the individual in 5 lectures. For Freud, the development process of the individual and society are the same. That is, the civilization is the individual written large. He's a liberal social contract theorist in the tradition of Kant, in the tradition of Hobbes, in the tradition of Locke, in the tradition of Rousseau. Freud indicates that we can, since the development of the individual for Freud and the development of civilization follow the same path and have the same methods showing, like paranoia, repression, he indicates that we can reach a diagnosis of the cultural superego. And sometimes, in certain situations, the cultural superego, or in some epochs, the whole population in society and on a broader scale become neurotic. They can also become paranoid, which is Sagan's claim. So the idea for Freud is that in society you'll see a superego at the cultural level, what he calls the cultural superego, in some periods in history are going to manifest what he's seen manifest in the individuals, and that is the whole population or a large segment of it can become neurotic, they can become paranoid. It becomes a problem for Freud, and we'll take a look at it at the end of Civilization and its Discontents, because the problem is, how do you measure neurosis in the individual and in society if everybody is in the same position? That is, how can you measure a neurosis in the individual in relation to the social if the environment itself is neurotic or paranoid or perverse? So Freud is opening it up to say the categories that we see in psychoanalysis can be applied to society at large. We're going to go through these terms. Then when we get to civilization and discontents, we're going to talk about the oceanic feeling. And I'll pull this back up. I'm going to go to the film, but I'll pull it back up because I provided a good definition there of the id, ego, and superego, a good working definition. So I'll bring that back up when we get there. And then chapter 2, we're going to take a look at the distinction between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, displacement illusion, and what love means for Freud. So let me start this. I'm not going to put it on full screen because I forgot to bring another device so I can see what time it is. Now this is found footage. I actually didn't. This is found footage. It's awesome found footage. So I used a clip grab. Then I edited it. I'll put it on full to start with, and then I'll pull it down afterwards. And again, I'm playing with white and the unconscious. You'll see that, I think this was shot last year. I think it was on a news station. So that's from clip grab, just so people can have some ideas on that. And what I've done is drop text of what's going to be in the lecture over it. And I'll obviously cut the clip, because the clip is like 2 minutes or something. we're starting with the fourth lecture in 5 lectures on psychoanalysis. The lectures that were given to introduce psychoanalysis to North America in 1909. And the next book we're going to is 1929. It's a mature work, okay? And I really believe that both these texts will give you a very solid footing or foundation in Freud, which is why they're on here. So in the fourth lecture, Freud drops this big surprise of psychoanalysis. The surprise is, and it's not a surprise for you because you know this because it's almost become part of popular culture. But it was a surprise when he introduces it in 1909. And the surprise is that it's not the events that occur at the time of a psychological illness that are crucial. Rather, it's events in puberty and early childhood that are going to explain and lead to or explain susceptibility to later traumas. So what the analyst has to do is uncover these memory traces. They have to bring them out of the unconscious to consciousness in order to get rid of the system. So if you've got either the PDF or the text, if you go to page 44, what Freud says on page 44 is that these powerful wish impulses of childhood, without exception, may be described as sexual. These powerful wishful impulses of childhood may, without exception, be considered sexual. It's on page 44, and it's the bottom of the first paragraph. What's revolutionary here is the recognition of children as sexual beings. Now, it's not revolutionary for us, because we've read Foucault. I assume we've read The History of Sexuality at some point. If not, The History of Sexuality is this 191-page book, which is pretty awesome, and it's a great critique of Freud. It used to be on this course, and it also used to be on a sexual politics course I taught. So Freud, and I will say, as we all know endlessly, made central to his theory of repression. Now, this theory of repression is at the individual and societal level. He's talking about it at the individual level at the moment. He made central to his theory of repression the fact that a child has sexual instincts from the time of birth. These are broadly defined, and they go into eros, and I want to just make sure that this is taping, so excuse me for a second. That's taping just fine. So from the time of birth, Freud argues that the child has what he calls a sexual instinct. Now, okay, we can all agree. Okay, sure. These pass into what he considers normal development. They pass through many stages to the so-called normal sexuality of the adult. And I'm really putting normal here in quotation marks, okay? Because by normal, what Freud means is heterosexual. When he says mature sexuality, it's a code word for heterosexual intercourse. So female sexuality doesn't fare particularly well with Freud. Homosexuality, on some footnotes, fares a bit better. If you want to take a look at Freud's theory of sexuality in detail, which is very interesting, and if you prefer to read some of Freud's writings rather than fiction, because it reads a lot, he writes well enough. I mean, Freud writes very, very well, so when you read it, it's also kind of like reading a novel. And he's very good at framing case studies, and he's very readable, as I'm sure you found out. So I would recommend 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. You'll find his whole theory of sexuality there, and repression. Now, he just gives a little bit in 5 lectures. At the core of child sexuality is autoeroticism, and the infamous Oedipal Complex. Now, you can tell immediately that he's influenced by Oedipal Rex. If you haven't read Oedipal X or seen the play, take a look on YouTube at a production of it. It's very interesting. What happens with King Oedipus, of course, is that he ends up, unbeknown to himself, when he's disguised as a beggar, killing what turns out to be his father and marrying, then he becomes king and marrying his mother, which the prophecies had told both the king and Oedipus that Oedipus left Thebes and for that not to happen. And it happened anyway. So, Freud is using the Oedipus complex, or the Oedipal complex, based on, he's developing it from the Greek story. What happens, Freud says, is that civilization, that is culture, the superego, wipes away memory traces of infinite sexuality. These get repressed in the unconscious like everything else. So for people that came in, we're on lecture 4 of 5 lectures. And then we're going to civilization and its discontents. And I began by giving a brief review of how politics is being defined. So let's talk about the Oedipal complex, object choice, sadism, and masochism. These are 3 terms that, at least 2 of them, become important in instinctual theory. In fact, Freud's instinctual theory is what all 3 of these hang on. His instinctual theory is that the libido, or instinctual components of sexual pleasure, so let's just say the instinctual components of sexual pleasure, presuppose taking a person, that is someone outside of oneself, as the object of desire, which is where you get to object choice. So the object choice for Freud ends up always being, so remember, he's influenced by Oedipal Rex, he's influenced by Greek myth, and he's influenced by the heterosexuality of his time, and he's influenced by middle-class nuclear families. So the object choice ends up always being the parent of the opposite sex. For Freud, it's simple and heterosexual. The female child takes the father as their object of desire, the male child the mother. The instincts themselves are passive and active. So we're all composed of passive and active instincts. They exist in these opposite pairs for Freud. He talks about active as a form of sadism, that's a desire to cause pain, and passive as masochism, the desire for pain. Connected in masochism is a desire for looking. In masochism, this desire for looking that is active in the sadist is passive in the masochist, so it's a desire to be looked at. It also gets manifest in artistic and theatrical display. So you've got the life instincts and the death instincts. So you've got passive and active instincts. You've also got, we'll put eros over with active, and thanatos with death. They don't actually map that way. Oh, that's good. They're both on there at the same time. So you've got the life instinct, which is eros, and the death instinct, which is thanatos. In conditions of war, the death instinct is obviously the instinct that is playing out. One can argue in conditions of smoothly operating democracy where the communities come together, what's playing out is eros, the life instinct. In every developmental process for Freud, the Oedipal process goes from autoeroticism as being obviously with just your own body, to the broad, so if you want your baby, it goes from their own body to the broad connection with an object choice of either parents. Freud says that the first object choice is the child's parents, and then it gets narrowed from the parents in general, because remember, this is something outside the child's body, to the opposite sex parent. Does that make sense? Really, to run through that again? I'm not saying, I think there's problems with this, and I'll talk about the problems in a second. But what Freud is saying is that the Oedipal process goes from the child, an autoeroticism, that it gets directed outside, and it gets directed outside to the first people it comes into contact with, which is the parents. Then it makes a distinction, and he'll tell you how it makes a distinction, which is interesting. Then the child makes a distinction between the parents of the same sex and the parents of the opposite sex. And Freud argues, being deeply embedded, I would say, in a heterosexual understanding, that the child chooses as its first object choice after the parents in general, the parent of the opposite sex. Then, once this works out, that continues on to outside the parental family. So it's a transition, and it's a transition to set up object choices that map onto a heterosexual paradigm. Let's just say that. I thought the train was really interesting, too, in terms of Freudian dreams and the train being standing in for a penis. In case you weren't aware of that, I thought it was clever to use that train there. Given that it's going through so much snow and everything, I thought there's like infinite possibility on that one. So, and you'll also see in his case studies where kids talk about trains and stuff, right? And if you've watched any Woody Allen films, same deal. Okay, so in every developmental process then, for Freud, the normal developmental process is from the containment of one's own body to the object choice of your parents, to the parents of the opposite sex, then to outside object choices. He sees female sexuality as becoming primarily passive and male as active. Now he gets strongly critiqued, obviously, by feminist theorists on this, including myself. He notes that there are, what he calls perversions in the developmental process. And these perversions are things that don't fit into the heterosexual model. So you can guess, for Freud, in 1909, what his perversions are. Homosexuality, sadomasochism, fetishism, and autoeroticism. And today we could say, okay, well, homosexuality, sexual orientation. So, but the other three are sort of niches in sexual expression and in the pornography industry. So they have all become quite acceptable. For Freud, they weren't. He saw them as an aberration of heterosexuality. So if you look at fetishism, because he talks about fetishism. Fetishism is always a good one to talk about. It refers to a sacred artifact that ends up being invested with spiritual and magical power. So this erotic fetish has a power. The erotic fetish can arouse and sometimes induce ecstasy in its possessor. So for a fetish, for someone who's a shoe fetish, the actual type of shoe can be more erotic than the foot that it's on. Or, the lingerie can be more exciting than the body that it's on. The whip can be more exciting than the person holding it. You go on and on. So I think we all, and fetishism gets interesting because no longer is it just erotic fetishism sort of contained with sexuality. You can map it over onto Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, and then you can say, wow, our whole culture really operates on a high degree of commodity fetishism, where if we have the new Jordan retro shoes, then, that's the new fetish item that came out this weekend. For some reason, I got a link to them. I'm like, damn, those are nice. So in a sense, what you have is this fetish desire for a lot of consumer products, which I probably don't need to tell people about. But I think it's hit a height at this point, because never before in history have we had search engines that can actually see what you're searching, and then when you're on Facebook or something else, provide you with lots of pictures of what you've been searching, so it keeps you wanting it. So we've got a very good form of techno-fetishism happening there. So fetishism for Freud is a translocation of desire. That is to say that the sexual impulse is directed away from the genitalia and toward another part of the body, and remember, or object. So remember for Freud that mature sexuality is always genital sexuality. And he's come under a lot of heat for this one. So this turning, let me just go to Jung for a minute. For Jung, for example, fixation on, and Freud and Jung work together, fixation on objects associated with childhood sexual encounters, or Jung, actually, let me back up. Jung says that fixation on objects such as diamonds, lingerie, I don't know, shoes, it's associated with childhood sexual encounters, and for Jung it applies arrested sexual development. Or, for example, babyism. There's a big, there was, and you probably know this, but there was a big, what would you call it, demand for places to enact babyism at lunch hour in New York. So there was, so if you're on First Avenue and the Lower East Side, there's actually Babyland there, where mostly high-powered people that are exactly. Because face it, people that don't have power don't really want to crawl around and be taken care of as babies, or maybe they do. But what you found happening with babyism is the desire to reenact your babyhood. It's usually people who have quite a bit of power and like being taken care of for this limited period of time. So Jung would say that was arrested sexual development. Freud would say that was a perversion, a fetish perversion. So the clinical definition of fetish is someone who cannot be aroused without the fetish item. There was a formal distinction when Freud was writing between erotic interest in inanimate objects, which he called fetishism, and erotic interest in parts of the body, which was called partialism. Fetishism has come to refer to both of those. So they're both combined under fetishism. Now, perversion is different from neurosis. In neurosis, you have the same instinctual components there, but they're repressed and they operate from the unconscious. In perversion, they're operating at a conscious level. You're engaged in it. So let's back up a little bit and take a look at the sexual development of children in the Oedipal Complex and object choice, which is at the core of perversions if it doesn't play out according to the heterosexual model, according to Freud. For a child, the first object choice are those, as I said, who looked after it. That is, the first object choice is that it gets narrowed to the parents. So the question, and here's a question that we were able to ask, and I don't know the answer to this, I would suspect yes, but the question is, does it only get narrowed to the parents because they're the primary caregivers? And they're perceived to hold the power of the child's life and death in their hands? Is that the reason? Is it because of the primary caregivers? So that means then whoever is the primary caregiver, it's going to be narrowed to the primary caregiver. And the way Freud explains it, if you take a look at page 51, he explains it very close to social construction. The child takes both of its parents as the object of erotic wishes. Then he says on page 51, I'll direct you to where that is. It's the second paragraph. That's actually 52, sorry. It's about 10 lines down. Actually, it's 4 lines down. It's a whole paragraph after that. So he says, it usually follows some indication, that it being the child, usually follows some indication from its parents whose affection bears the clearest characteristics of a sexual activity. And you're like, what? So it's the parents' treatment of the child that determines the child's object choice. And this treatment tends to fall according to gender lines, according to Freud. Now, still on page 51, he says, and it's a continuation of what I just read, as a rule, a father prefers his daughter and a mother his son. The child reacts. Now, he's not indicating there that it's a sexual preference. He's just saying that as a rule, where it gets set up is the way that the opposite sex parent is treating that particular child. So, take it with a grain of salt. Because then you get into some really interesting questions, which Trotterell raises, some of them. One is that in today's family structure of same-sex parents and single parents, what becomes of the Oedipal situation? That's a really good question. The second question I would ask, and Judith Butler asks this, Butler is not on the course, but you've probably come across gender trouble in some of the courses you've taken. She asks, when gender roles break down and are fluid, when both parents work, both do maintenance in the home, how is this traditional Oedipal situation changed? And it is changed. But if you go back to Freud in 51, he says, as a rule, a father prefers his daughter, a mother her son. What happens, according to Freud, is that the child reacts to the situation that's put in place by the parents by wishing to take the parent's place who is not his object choice. That is, and remember, he's using the Oedipal myth here, and the Oedipal story coming out of Oedipus Rex, Greek myth. So, the son wishes to take his father's place and have his mother. The daughter wishes to take her mother's place and have the father. The feelings are positive and negative. Positive toward the object of desire and hostile toward the parent, the same-sex parent. That is, the child feels that the same-sex parent is inhibiting the full attention or love of the parent as the object of desire. Now, that's the opposite sex parent. Now, the parent's job is to direct this, stage of attachment appropriately and direct it outside. And, parents do fail on this, obviously. But Freud saw it as a stage which will then be directed outside to an external object choice. So then you get things like people choosing in their more grown-up objects of choice, people that are similar to their parents, or not, or directly opposite. But, so I don't know, again, I would take that with a grain of salt, and I would also say that the questions posed by Trotterell and Butler, what happens when you've got same-sex parents, when you've got two daddies? What happens when both male and female parents are doing the same roles both at home and outside? And I would say it's one of the three conditions that, and when the other one we're going to talk about in terms of Fanon, actually four conditions that blow the Oedipal complex out of the water. So I don't know how valid it is. I mean, it was certainly valid when I was growing up, but it was valid in the sense that you get jealous of the parent of the opposite sex because you're not getting enough attention, even though, hey, I was an only child and getting endless attention. So, I played out, I guess it plays out, if you want to really break it down, at a cultural level, it plays out in assumed heterosexuality. How's that? Does that make sense? I mean, I don't know. There's, and you can also sort of try and ask, well, did it ever play out? Did it only play out in a particular segment, and because it was there as a cultural meme? I don't know, does anybody want to add to this? Because I feel like I'm really trying to make it clear, and I know it sounds weird, and I know it also has played out at points. Yes, Patrick?
I was just wondering what Freud would think if you were raised as like an orphan. We didn't have either parent.
Great. And so you had an institutional parent, or you had foster care. You had foster care homes where they kept shifting.
Yeah.
All of those are applicable. So that really gets, and that's a good question, because it really gets to the point that Freud's theory, which has so much cultural currency, and still has cultural currency, really applies to a particular segment at a particular time. And that's really one of the things I'm trying to emphasize. But yes, that's a good question. Anybody else on that? Yes?
Didn't he specifically say that he had like some, he had to broaden his definition of sexuality instead of just focusing on what we currently see as sexuality?
Oh, absolutely, because he's talking about eros.
Yeah. So doesn't that mean that it's not just like sexual attraction, it's kind of just...
Absolutely. Did you come in?
Yes.
Okay, I was going to say, yeah. Maybe I didn't go over it well enough. But eros is the life instinct, it's a sexual instinct. So yes, when he's talking about child sexuality, he's also talking about child autoeroticism, but he's also talking about this desire to be loved. And that's a very good question. And he's talking about the fact that one tends to have it set up, and he's saying the parents themselves set this up. You know, and I mean, you can guess how you set it up. You call somebody your little man, or you know how or you call So in that sense, the parents are actually, it's not the child, but it's the parents that are culturally producing it. And very good clarification, and I'm really glad you asked that, because he's not simply talking about sexual arousal and sexual attraction. He's also talking about eros as a broad concept of instinctual life energy. And he's kind of combining those together there. So that's a very good clarification. So, the Oedipal Complex, because of hostile feelings toward one parent, and because of these forbidden feelings of desire, gets repressed at an early age. And what do we know about repressed feelings? Well, they get lodged in the unconscious, and once they're in the unconscious, they exert more influence from there than if they had existed at the conscious level. So, Freud makes this claim, and this is why we were doing the Oedipal Complex. He says that the heart of every neurosis is the Oedipal Complex. That is, it's the central complex of every neurosis. We find it at work in other regions of mental life, in dreams, in neurosis. As I said before, it's named after the myth of King Oedipus, who killed his father and married his mother against his knowing, and then ends up taking pins out of her dress and stabbing his own eyes out. The mother kills herself. Freud says this infantile wish occurs generationally. There's a taboo erected against it. It's an incest taboo, and it's an incest taboo that extends to the family. Now, in terms of normal development for Freud, as the child matures, the parent as the object of desire, of course, is replaced by outsiders. And parents start this early. You hear people saying to their little kids, like, when you grow up and get married and have a family of your own. Okay, so you've got it there at popular cultural discourse. Now, the fifth and final lecture in 5 lectures. Is everybody okay with that? Because I think your question was really important, because I don't want people going away thinking it's just narrowed down to a sexuality. It's a combination of this idea of care as well, because remember, the parents are caring for you, so the touch you feel to begin with is there. Like, it's all of that combined together. So that's a good takeaway. He's gone through that in lecture 4 to say it's at the core of all neurosis. That is, at the core of neurosis is not what happened most immediately, but can be traced back to childhood. Now, here's something weird. So if you're in therapy and your therapist is treating whatever you've got going on, which could be, hey, I can't write my essays because I have a writer's block. Every student's gone through that. Okay, now the best way of dealing with that is probably brief therapy and not psychoanalysis. But okay, say you're in psychoanalysis. If that gets traced back, you can spend a lot of time figuring out how that's embedded in your unconscious, how it's related to the Oedipal complex, how it was that you came home from school and somebody said this was great, you have to do this good again, or like all that. You can trace all that back. It could be valuable. It also, like I write to page number, word number, and deadline. And it's not that hard, but I probably, years ago, I think I did work in terms of bracketing bracketing an internal critic that says, you know the internal critic when you're writing it, you're like chugging along there, and it seems okay, but your internal critic is going, no, this is shit. You can do better. You don't understand the text. If you can just bracket that, regardless of whatever therapy model you're using, you've got, bracket it and edit it when you're done. And it works beautifully. And one just, the more one writes, obviously, the easier it gets and the better it's going to get. Fifth and final lecture here with 5 lectures. It deals with 2 important aspects of psychoanalytic theory. The first, and he talks about this in the first lecture, and that is what distinguishes the neurotic from the normal person. Well, the normal person is the successful person in brackets. And the successful person, unlike the neurotic person, although we're all neurotic, according to Freud, but the successful person who keeps their neurosis in check succeeds in his or her efforts, Freud always says his efforts in turning his wish fantasies into reality. So whatever's occurring as wish fantasies, they turn into reality, but they do it in the form of sublimation. All culture is sublimation. Okay. Now you can guess if you're in a war zone, it's not sublimated. You've got Santos run wild. So Freud's saying that in civilization, in cultured civilization, that means you've got, I would say, a democratic government. He's assuming a democratic government there. Now remember, he's going into Nazi Germany. It's 1929 when he gets to the next book. He has to leave Vienna. He gets out of Vienna, I think it's after 33 or so, 39, and goes to London, if I remember correctly. But he has to write a note that the Gestapo get him to write a note. And there's this famous note to say that he's met with the Gestapo and they treated him fine. And so what Freud writes is, I can highly recommend the Gestapo, which is a joke because we all know what the Gestapo was doing to Jews. And I mean, Freud's Jewish, and not just Jews, but homosexuals. Actually, many of the people that didn't fit into the normal development that Freud had set out in his theory. So, normal and neurotic people have the same complexes. But the neurotic person is able to sublimate them into artistic creations, writing, work. Work is a good sublimation. The difference between neurotic and normal is the strength of these instinctual forces combined with, so it's like a velocity, the strength of the instinctual forces and the person's ability to repress these forces, to deal with these forces, or to sublimate them. Okay, so that's the main difference. The difference is the strength of the instinctual forces combined with the person's ability to repress or deal with them or sublimate. So that's the first concept that's important there. The second is transference. We engage in transference all the time. Transference is a big psychoanalytic concept. Freud claims that in every psychoanalytic treatment of a neurotic, transference appears and it has to appear. What happens in transference is that the patient directs towards the analyst affectionate feelings combined with hostility. Okay? So, if anybody's here is working as an analyst in training, which you could be at, and you kind of, you'll be trained to deal with this. You'll be trained to deal with the fact that the person is directing towards you both, affectionate feeling of like love for no apparent reason and hostility. And it's not based on any real relation between the two of them. It's a specific symptom that every patient in analysis manifests. And of course, for Freud, every patient is thought to be neurotic. The transference is necessary to get to these old wishful fantasies of the patients that are in her unconscious or his unconscious. So in this transference of like affection and hostility, the patient is going to re-experience part of an emotional life that they can't consciously remember. And they're going to re-experience it in a safe environment in relation to the analyst who's trained to know what to do with it. And sometimes it all goes haywire. It goes, of course, transference goes back to the Oedipal situation. That's where the emotions of affection and hostility first occur. And it's very simple to see that. Like if you watch a baby, if their needs aren't being met by the parents, who are their first objects of choice, they start screaming and yelling and they feel that they have been neglected. So that it's not that difficult to see where he's coming from. And then when you actually get to children who have been neglected, what they really experience more than affection is hostility. And many children obviously have been neglected and abused. So you can see that, and that's their first sort of point of contact with others. Freud claims that it's only the re-experience in transfer that convinces. You're in a therapy situation, and you've got these weird emotions of like, you think you're in love as a client, you think you're in love with your therapist, but it doesn't make any sense, and you're really angry with them, and that also doesn't make any sense. Freud says that you're in transference, and that it's this re-experience that occurs in transference is one of the things that convinces Freud of the Oedipal complex. What's re-experienced in the transference is what went on in the first place. So transference is not something that's created by the psychoanalyst. It's not something that's created by the technique of psychoanalysis. And you could say, well, maybe it is. And you could have something there, because if you're doing free association, if you're working with the unconscious, maybe psychoanalysis is what allows it to come up. Freud says no, it's in all human relations. Now what we've got in 5 lectures on psychoanalysis is basically the bricks of psychoanalysis that we're going to carry forward into politics. So at the foundation is instinctual theory. Instinctual theory, which we're going to talk about more in Civilization and Discontents, but the instinctual theory of Thanatos, which is the death instinct, and Eros, which is the life instinct. So Thanatos is destruction, obviously, and Eros is combining and bringing together into a wider and wider community. You also have the Oedipal Complex, which becomes the source of much neurotic impulses that are unsuccessfully repressed in the unconscious. If they're successfully repressed, then you've got neurosis. If they're unsuccessfully repressed, what you're going to have then is perversion. If they're successfully repressed, they're going to slip through in terms of dreams, symptoms, parapraxis. You'll get to them through free association. And what we're going to do then is move to Freud's theory of civilization. Right. 20 years later, pre-World War II, you can see that fascism is raising up in Europe. And so Freud writes this, it's 20 years after the 5 lectures, it's 10 years before he died. And it's a total theory. It's a totalizing system of the instincts from the individual to society. It's a totalizing system of the instincts and of the necessity for their repression in order for civilization to develop. So, he would argue that in fascism, as it was manifest in Nazi Germany, Phantos was not suppressed. Phantos, the death instinct ran rapid. Civilization and its Discontents is a mature work. Freud has cancer when he's writing it, so when he's writing about pain, keep that in mind. He has mouth cancer from cigar smoking. He also has a coke habit, which is kind of interesting. Although people will just say he did coke, but I think he probably had coke. He was doing coke, which gets you something when you get to intoxication. That's where that's going. He begins the very first chapter. I think it's a great book. I mean, I think, okay, 5 lectures gives you the concept. Civilization and Discontents is a complete work. And it's like a narrative. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a very interesting narrative. It does do something really well in terms of the oceanic feeling, for example. So he begins with a summary and a footnote to his book, The Future of Illusion. Now, The Future of Illusion is on religion. He wrote it 2 years previously, in 1927. And it examines how religion is central to civilization. So what you're getting in this whole text is a theory of civilization. It's what a postmodernist like Jean-Francois Lyotard would call a meta-narrative. Freud, like Marx, is giving a meta-narrative. It's totalizing. It gives you a complete picture where everything falls into place and everything is accounted for. There's always a problem with that because nothing ever really fits, right? As we found out. But it is a meta-narrative. And Freud is writing it as an atheist. He begins the very first chapter with a response to his friend. It's a response and a discussion of Roland's work on the oceanic feeling. The oceanic feeling becomes an important concept for Freud. What he incorporates from Roland's work is the idea of the oceanic feeling. What Roland says is that the true source of religious sentiments is a sensation of eternity. Religion gives people a feeling of something that's limitless, without bounds, something that's oceanic. This feeling becomes subjective in the individual, and it's the source of religious, and I would argue, political energy. And Sagan will argue that it's a source of political energy. It's a source of religious energy, which then is directed by religious systems into their own purposes. So Freud takes the idea of the oceanic feeling and he puts it in relation to the self, in relation to the ego and the id. So I want to go to the lecture bullet points for a minute. That's the presentation schedule. He takes a look at how the ego and the id are going to process such a feeling. So the ego, and I give a definition of the id, ego, and superego on the bullet points. So let me just go through that and then I'll go to what I've got to say. So the id, ego, and superego, I'll see if the trackpad works here. No, I was in to try and figure out why my trackpad was not working. Apparently, programs override it. Except the pictures. Can you see okay? Okay. So, 3 structures of the psyche. The id is that unconscious, pre-rational, pre-subjective, quasi-instinctual. It's the source of the instinctual drives. The ego is the self, the bounded self. It's the I. It's the functions that we do in relation to our environment. And the superego is the cultural. It's what we develop in terms of our relations with early authorities that are going to produce, conscience and moral precepts. So the ego is the conscious mind. It's not autonomous from the id, the unconscious mental activity. There's no clear mark between the ego and the id. Rather, they flow into each other, the way the conscious and unconscious flow into each other, because that's what he's talking about. Externally, in relation to others and objects, the ego is clearly demarcated, it's autonomous, but internally it flows back and forth, the id and the ego flow back and forth. Now there's one state externally in which the ego is not very clearly demarcated, and that's the state of being in love, where you enter into a symbiotic relationship, where you feel at one with the other person. Can I assume people here have been in love? We all know what I'm talking about. And then all of a sudden the bottom falls out of it, and then, that's gone. But there's it's very close to what I'm going to describe as the oceanic feeling. It's this sense of not being, of always being with a person, they're feeling like they're an extension of yourself and vice versa. And then, things are going along really good in this model, and then, oops, somebody lets somebody down somehow, because you can't really go endlessly, although some people can, as an extension of the other. But the height of being in love, Freud says. So you kind of get, and Freud actually was really in love, so you can kind of get where this is coming from. Okay, so the height of being in love, this boundary between self and other, ego and object being another person, it dissolves. It's a physiological process where this happens. Of course, we know it can also be, I'll get right to you, Patrick, just let me finish this one sentence. We also know that it can be a pathological process. And it's a pathological process when you break up with somebody because you no longer have this love connection and they will not leave you alone. That happens a lot. Their ego boundaries, they can't bring their ego boundary back in a way that it's not in a symbiotic relationship with you. Yeah, Patrick.
I was just wondering, I know some people say that love is socially constructed. I was wondering what you thought.
Well, my own personal opinion?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because well, sure, of course it is. And it's also, and there's a physiological response. Okay, so you've got it socially constructed. What's socially constructed, I would say, is what it means to be in love. Okay, the terms of what constitutes being in love. And then what you get is a physiological response. Okay, and your physiological response is both in relation to social construction and something you come up with on your own. But chances are the not being able to eat, not being able to breathe very well, not being able to sleep, feeling like all connected first stages. So you can see how these can get pathological pretty quickly. Yes?
I think you're being stopped recording.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I wonder what happened there. I turned off it did. Low battery. Okay, well. It's recording, but it came up low battery, but thank you. I got 20% left. I don't know. It's plugged in last night, but I think we'll make it through there. We have about 20 minutes left, and if it just cuts off, well, the lecture can, we wouldn't want them to miss my definition of psychotic love. Okay, so so I think, Patrick, that's a really, really good question because it is socially constructed in a way. And then there's also a connection that happens. And then, it will grow in, as everybody says, it will shift into something else. The first stages can be either, they're very physiological and can be pathological. And you can get pathological stuff breaking out. Does that make sense? Is that what you think or no? What do you think?
I'm not really sure.
I was going to say, I don't know. Yes?
So how would somebody like Freud, or like a psychotherapist, treat somebody with something like that?
Yeah, that's good, actually. Well, I've got some good... I don't know what Freud would say about a broken heart. I guess Freud would say, what Freud would do was get to the point of when it broke and develop from there and get you to talk about it. What I would say, skydiving. There's nothing like leaping out of a plane and hurling and then putting a parachute on that will clear your head and really work with a broken heart. Okay, and then if it doesn't work the first time, do it again.
So you don't make the broken heart, you shatter it.
I don't know, you just shift consciousness, then learn a new skill. You know, there's a whole bunch of things. I would say that work. You know, and give yourself a couple of years. Seems like it takes a couple of years, but Freud, I think, and it's a very good question, but skydiving, I swear by it. That Freud would say that you get to the source of it, and then you kind of go from there, I guess. And it's interesting, he never talked about any patient coming in with, well, he did, but it was a broken heart a broken heart to do with not being able to save your son. It wasn't a romantic broken heart, right? I mean, so there's different types of broken hearts too. I think the worst type is when you actually feel responsible for letting somebody die, right? Like that, and Freud has talked about people who've had that feeling in case studies in hysteria, for example, but not the romantic one. It's a good question, though. So it's a physiological process, as I said, that can also, and if you don't mind, if you look up and you see it's cut off, I'll just turn it off. It's a physiological process that also can occur as a pathological process. So we all know about the pathology, right? You know, like having to get restraining orders and people breaking people's car windows and just on and on. That means it's gone bad, and they should be jumping out of a plane or something. So what he's trying to say is our boundary lines between the ego and the outside world are fluid. They're fluid, and we can either have them taken up in another person, we can have them taken up in a cause, we can have them taken up in our work. You know, you kind of say to yourself, how is it that people get so politically involved in something? They believe it, but it's more than just belief or religiously involved. That is a sense of the boundary lines between the ego and the external world as being fluid. So initially, to go back to the child again, the ego and the external world, like the ego includes the external world. It includes everything. So she would be my equivalent of my niece. She's a PhD in clinical psychology, and she just had a baby. She's an awesome mom, actually. And one of the things is, the baby's 4 months old, so she and her partner, they're a complete extension of this small infant, right? They're a complete extension of it. It's the baby views the mother, everything as an extension of their own body. So where Freud talks about viewing the mother's breast as an extension of one's own body when you're an infant, and then it becomes a shocking reality when you actually recognize that the breast and the mother are external objects. They're not just an extension of you. Some people never learn that. And some people have to realize that whatever they're involved with in intimate relationships are not just an extension of themselves. So Freud holds that the adult ego is the residue of a much larger, all-embracing feeling between the ego and the world, where, to begin with, there was no self or external or object. We were all one. He's built into the oceanic feeling. Now, I know that I've probably been lecturing now for an hour and 35 minutes. I'm going to go to 1. If you guys need to stand up, please do, because face it, look, I'm running all over. And it's hard when you're sitting down for me for any sort of length of time. So if you want to stand up, stretch, whatever. So then, if the adult ego is a residue of much larger, all-embracing feeling, it's something we lose when we actually become self-conscious as a human being. He makes this analogy. Freud likes analogies to ancient cities and archaeology. So he says in the city of Rome, it's on page 17, the ruins, so in the other book, in 5 lectures, it was London. Now he's looking at Rome. He says, the ruins lying beneath the contemporary city, he uses to draw a parallel with the mind. In the mind, if something is formed there, it doesn't disappear. Rather, it's layered the way ruins are layered. So you've seen ruins in various locations, and you can see that ruins are built on ruins. And you get, especially if you're in an old location, what you get are previous ones and previous ones. So if you've ever watched an archaeological dig, when you go back, you're going to find layer upon layer. So like an archaeological dig, Freud says, when regression goes back far enough, what is buried then gets brought to the surface. In the individual and at collective levels, and this is where it gets important, at collective levels, whatever once existed isn't going to completely disappear. So the fact that fascism, Nazism, neocolonialism, you name it, bizarre forms of nationalism have existed, they're not going to ever completely disappear from a global context. They've been resurfaced. Earlier phases of development exist alongside or beneath later ones. So what is past in mental life gets preserved. He goes back then from that example, and he gives you historical examples in Rome. And clearly he's pretty fascinated by Rome. So he goes back and he says, okay, when you were a child, there was no separation between you and the external world. You had a sense of oneness with the world. This resurfaces in adulthood in the form of the oceanic feeling. Freud, so Roland, that's his term, but Freud does something different with it. What Freud does is he traces the oceanic feeling back to early phases, or the early phase of the ego, where the child is still at one with the external, there's no separation of self and object. And he says, hey, this feeling is the source of religion. It's a source of energy. It's also the expression of a strong need. He comes close to Marx's understanding of religion, which is that religion is basically the need for a strong authority figure on an individual and mass level. But Freud says it's not the source of religion that creates the oceanic feeling. Rather, it picks up on what was there before, and that's the infant's helplessness. That when we were an infant, we had a need for parent protection. I mean, he says father's protection. I'm going to say parent protection. So he traces or links the religious attitude as far back as the feeling of infantile helplessness. When we become adults, the oceanic feeling becomes connected with religion. But religion, for Freud, is not the source of this. It just picks up on it. You know, political, what would you call it? I would say action. Political action is good. Political belief that is as strong as religion, the source of that goes back to the child's feeling of helplessness. What Freud argues is that oneness with the universe is an attempt at religious consolation, to compensate for the danger that we recognize that's threatening us from the external world. I would add to that, well, he sees dangers in three ways. So, you know, religion is also very helpful for people whose lives are not going, you know, in a way that they sort of wanted. That the external world is, in a sense, what? Their connection with it is not, they're feeling a helpless connection with it. Let's say that. Now, you can also get this through yoga. I don't know how many people here have done or do yoga. I took intensive yoga in Australia for about 2 months. And I do it, but the intensive yoga was incredible because I was doing yoga, 4 to 5 hour yoga classes a day, and I swear I could not walk. I could not lift my leg up to actually get in the car. But it was, and then all of a sudden it was awesome. But so what Freud is saying is, and I didn't actually experience any of the things Freud was saying here except pain, that there's a withdrawal from the external world, a fixation on body functions in yoga and breathing methods. And what you end up doing is you can regress to a state of mind that has a oneness connection. And yes, when you're meditating, you feel this oneness connection. You feel centered. Okay, so there's a program called OMM, and I have it on my phone. It gives you 1 minute meditation. So you click it and you go. You meditate for 1 minute. Now, something really interesting. I first put it on there because I was like, how can anybody get, because I've meditated for half an hour and stuff, right? I was like, wow, how can anybody get like this oneness-centered feeling in 1 minute? That 1 minute is bizarre. It seems like it's like much, much longer. So I do believe that's what Freud is talking about, that you get it in, meditation, you get it in ecstasies that are drug-induced, ecstasies that are, religion-induced. Yes? So it's off? No. Okay, low power mode. I'm going to continue. We'll see if it's still going. Yeah, I mustn't have charged it properly. Maybe the cord wasn't working. Thank you. Let's see what that can pick up. We have about 10 minutes left, and it should be good. We have to have more, but it'll cut off. So, The Future of Illusion, his book, is not so much about the oceanic feeling. It's mostly about what the common person understands by religion. What Freud ends up saying there, and I'm not recommending the book, but he says that the common person can only imagine providence. That is something that watches over your life and compensates you in a future for the pains of this existence in terms of the Christian God, okay, or the Jewish God as an exalted father. And I'm not going to say anything about other religions because I don't know them as well. So in any religion where there's an exalted father, that is kind of what Freud is looking at in the future of religion. He goes back then and he looks at Goethe, and he says, it's very interesting, Goethe says that science, art, and religion, takes a look at science, art, and religion, and Goethe has this quote, and this is the beginning of chapter 2. For those who possess science and art, they have religion. So he's saying you can find the same thing that religion does in science and art. But those who possess neither science nor art, they need religion. Religion is this necessary palliative for a harsh life. And it's more than that, face it. I mean, when I grew up, I was a Sunday school teacher. It's not, which is kind of interesting, because my job was basically to keep the 13-year-old people quiet while the service was going on and do something with them. So in a sense, then, it's a palliative measure for the hardness of life. And he says we as human beings can't deal with life without these sort of palliative measures. And then he lists 3 ways of coping with life. Now these work pretty good. One is deflection. Make light of your miseries. Powerful deflection, which allows us to make light of our misery. This is on page 24. Or, okay, the other is substitute satisfactions. Your heart's broken, you didn't get the object of your desire, but you really enjoyed jumping out of planes. That's substitute satisfaction, which is going to diminish our misery. And the third, Freud says, on page 24, is intoxicating substances, which is going to make you forget your miseries. Okay? Now, he doesn't give any value judgments on those 3. He's just setting them out there. Partly what you get with intoxicating substances and music is, and I know this for various reasons, but also because somebody did a paper on it years ago in Psychology and Politics, with intoxicating rave drugs, you get a body coming together as a collective body, and you get a sense of oneness with the world and with others. So you can apply that. So that's, in a sense, making one forget their miseries. He then examines the purpose of life. And he says, look, there's never been a satisfactory answer. Religion attempts to provide an answer to the question. And religion does give life a purpose. And it does, in a sense, Freud says, okay, it gives life a purpose, and that is to serve God. But what Freud proposes is what he considers to be a less ambitious question. That is, what do humans want? What do they show by their behavior to be the purpose and intention of their lives? Well, simple. They want two things. They want happiness, however that's defined. However you individually define happiness, it's going to be the absence of pain and the experience of strong feelings of pleasure. What he does here in chapter 2 of Civilization and Discontents is he introduces the pleasure principle. So I think I have the pleasure principle there, and I'll go back. Let me go back to the film for a while. Which is still right. The pleasure principle is the satisfaction of needs. He says, okay, the satisfaction of needs has to be sudden. If the situation that's desired is prolonged, you end up with mild contentment. But if it's sudden, there's intense enjoyment. So the possibilities of happiness are actually restricted by our human constitution. Because usually we work for something, we get it, and we're not as pleased as we were just before we thought we were going to get it. I don't know if that applies. But that's his argument. He says unhappiness is much easier to experience. Because as humans, we're under the threat of happiness from three sources. That is, our happiness, I'm pretty happy right now. I got all my work done that I needed to get done for today. Okay, tonight I have to go through 35 files for an admissions committee, but everything, I got everything done, I'm awesome. But we're subject to unhappiness from three sources. One is from our own body, which is going to decay. Like there's no way out of it. And Freud is very much aware of this. And so he sees pain and anxiety as warning signs that the body is going to decay. The second is the external world. The external world's always a source of unhappiness. There's forces of destruction in nature, more and more because of our irresponsibility in terms of ecology. There's more and more forces of destruction in nature. And thirdly, we're always at the threat of unhappiness in our relation to other human beings because they're never going to do what you want them to. Now, he defines the pleasure principle as, it's a great definition, he says, the mind tends to operate in such a way as to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. That sounds pretty utilitarian. It sounds pretty Bentham-like. So the mind tends to operate in such a way as to achieve pleasure and avoid pain, or what he calls unpleasure. The pleasure principle is always subject to these, your own body, natural disaster, or the external world, and relations with others. So the pleasure principle is always under the influence and responding to the effects of the external world. Okay, what can you do about that? Not much. So you end up taking the pleasure principle and turning it into what Freud calls the reality principle. So in order to have a cultural civilization, you're going to take the pleasure principle, which is directed by either Eros or Thanatos, and you're going to turn it into what he calls the reality principle. That's what you do in terms of your relation with others and the external world. Or, in terms of your relation with others, you can stay away from other people, Freud says. But he suggests a better way. He says becoming a member of the human community and banding against nature, that's a social contract, will allow you, then you move from the pleasure principle to the reality principle. The other way is intoxication. For Freud, suffering is sensation. It exists as long as we feel it. And remember, Freud, as I said, was in great pain when he wrote it. He's on heavy doses of morphine. So in the third example I gave, in intoxication, foreign substances get introduced into the blood or tissues, and you're going to have pleasurable sensations. And they're going to alter the conditions that manage our senses so that we're not going to get, this is Freud, not me, so that we're not going to get unpleasurable impulses. But Freud says, okay, there's those ways. Stay away from other people, intoxication, but by the best one is, developing a reality principle that's going to be in charge of the pleasure principle. And you're going to do this in relation to a human community and banding against nature. So, how do we avoid suffering? Well, we can try and master our instincts. The examples he gives are much like Nietzsche's through yoga and Eastern wisdom. We can subject, and Freud says that works for some people, but on a smaller scale and a larger scale in terms of everybody, we can control instinctual life by subjecting our ego to the reality principle. Okay, so our expectations and needs are lessened, but there's a protection against, a lot of suffering from others and from the external. Instinctual impulses of thanatos and eros get inhibited when they come in contact with the reality principle. The reality principle is basically what society will allow of the pleasure principle. So some societies allow more of the pleasure principle to operate, what it is, and some less. So what the reality principle is the socially acceptable repression and control of our drives that will allow civilization to function. It's going to postpone the achievement of pleasure. And it's also going to reduce pleasure. So the ego then tames the instincts. Happiness gets lessened, but so does pain. Perverse instincts, those that haven't been tamed by the ego, get mediated by the reality principle. And after chapter 2, and I think chapters 1 and 2 are maybe the most interesting, after chapter 2, civilization and its discontents becomes pretty equivalent to a social contract theory. It's equivalent to other social contract theories that I ran through. It sets out the foundation of civilization. Freud does it in terms of taming the instincts, in terms of the reality principle taking over and dominating the pleasure principle. And then he goes on to other ways of preventing suffering. Okay, so the first way, and the one he's going to suggest, is the taming of the instincts, the ego overtaking the id, the reality principle, which is what is acceptable of the instincts playing out in society, and the others being, and what's not acceptable in terms of Thanos and Eros, these being sublimated and repressed. Now the second, so that's his first technique, the reality principle. The second technique for preventing suffering is displacement. So what you do in displacement, you sublimate instincts that are not socially acceptable under the reality principle into art. Art's always a good one. Into writing, into science. This method's only available to a few people. The third one is illusion. This is available to everybody at the individual and a group level. It's where religion comes in at the group level. In a sense, at the individual level, illusion is living in the imagination. It's what he calls a delusional reality. He says that it's somewhat like paranoia in that we correct some aspect of the world we don't like through constructing a wish. And then we take this wish or delusion and we put it into reality, which allows him then to get back onto religion, because Freud is quite anti-religion, and which which allows him then to say that religion is a collective delusion. It's a delusional remolding of reality. So if you wonder what he's talking about, take a look at some of the late night evangelical television shows on religion. You can kind of see what Freud's getting at there. Freud says that the religions of mankind are types of mass delusion. Now, mass delusion becomes important because this is 1929. Fascism's on the horizon. He's seeing fascism, in a sense, as a religious, what would you call it? A religious fever, in a sense. People are as strongly attached to fascism as they are to religion. So this mass delusion is also which Sagan's going to pick up, and then somebody like Wilhelm Reich does. He's not on the course, because Wilhelm Reich has this great book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, where he sees religion as a mass delusion coming out of Freud. He sees politics, and particular types of politics, is also capable of being a mass delusion, because they operate according to the oceanic feeling of belonging. The trick is nobody who shares a delusion recognizes it as a delusion. The fourth way is what he calls an art of living. So you don't end up setting up giving up your pleasure principle, and well, you do, and having a reality principle, which is the first one. The second one is displacement. The third one is religion. The fourth one is what he calls the art of living. And it's rooted in the external world. And that is, in the art of living, which I would recommend, you get objects, you derive happiness from the external world, from objects in the external world, from an emotional relationship to them. The art of living isn't interested in just avoiding pain, but it's got this strive for a positive fulfillment of happiness. Freud says this art of living is perhaps the only technique that holds on to the original passionate striving for a positive fulfillment of happiness. Yes?
So is the art of living just like being materialistic? Is that what
Nope.
you're saying?
But it is, you came in relatively late, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So it is in relation to the external world. Okay? But it's not in relation to the external world in an attempt to consume goods or materials. But it's like not denying the external world, it's working with the reality principle, in the reality principle, having an emotional relationship to the external world, humans and sort of objects. It's a positive sort of fulfillment of happiness. He says it's perhaps the only technique that holds on to the original passionate striving for positive fulfillment of happiness. So he equates then this art of living with making love the center of existence, whether it's love on a person-to-person or love in terms of a broader community. And it seeks to find all satisfaction in loving and being loved. Now, everyone has access to this. He's talking about sexual love, he's talking about emotional love. Then he moves on to the aesthetics of life. Aesthetics as in beauty, as a subset of the art of living. Erich Fromm has a book he picked up from Freud, he called it The Art of Living. So a subset of this is the aesthetics of life, and this is the enjoyment of beauty. The enjoyment of beauty, of course, doesn't protect against suffering, and it doesn't produce an intoxicating feeling. However, it does fit within the enjoyment of life. So the last technique then is a flight into neurosis. So for the last technique, Freud says it's not really a very positive technique, rather it's a flight into neurosis,